actually a metropolitan perspective under the guise of human rights, freedom of commerce, and humanitarian intervention, must answer the challenge of those who reclaim a space, place, and site, as well as actual city streets and virtual back alleys, against the metropolitan view, without reservation, in love and abandon, without expecting anything in return, à fond perdu. Kant's lectures on physical geography should be read together and in contrast with speculative or metaphysical geography. The latter accorded moral authority to the concept of place. Geography and politics were closely allied in a cosmological tradition that imagined the orderly workings of the machine of the world. As such, it informed a set of beliefs and regulatory practices associated with Christian Europe's great territorial expansion in the latter half of the 15th century, and thus also, decisively, classical international law. The former, physical geography, in fact rejected the mechanistic sense of a space present in the machina mundi tradition. Kant adopted a view that mediated between a Leibnizian view of a space as an empty container for things, mediated between a Leibnizian view of a space as a product of relations between things and a Newtonian view of a space as an empty container for things. But what did he replace them with? With perspective. The view from above, supplementing linear perspective. A collection of measures determined by our perceptions without synthesis or vanishing point. As Immanuel Kant's lectures on geography illustrate, the assumption that Caribbean man, as he called it, the slave, is incapable of cognitive and imaginary feats necessary to establish a stability and horizon, survived the downfall of linear perspective. Also the subsequent transition from metaphysical to physical grounding, to which Kant's contribution was so decisive. In fact, it can be argued that the problem was intensified. Descriptive and prescriptive prejudices were turned into images, and thus into the very frame of physical or scientific grounding. The sense and function of description was inverted, writes Michel Cohen-Halimi in her introduction to the French version of Kant's Geographie. That which is set within sight is in the same movement displaced out of view. She says, in relation to the blind spot of Kantian critique. The point being that the experience of encounter, cosmopolitan encounter or discovery, is simultaneously that of a continuous global separation or distancing, a persistent and fundamental misunderstanding, or as I prefer, a missed encounter. This is the concrete form of unevenness. Also the very problem identified by Frantz Fanon in the very first pages of The Wretched of the Earth, when he tells us, you all know the story, that he encounters in the street a white mother with her child, upset at the sight of a black man. This is also the issue posited by Turner's depiction of the Somme incident. It is not the case that Kant misses the problem of unevenness, rather he disavows it. According to him, unable to calculate, Caribbean man could neither contemplate a futural horizon of economic progress nor govern themselves. The question of legitimate self-governance, posited by Rousseau as the problem of general will, or in Allende's terms, those of 1970s international legal debates, independence and geo-economic self-determination is obscured by the appeal to cosmopolitanism and its physical or metropolitan scientific grounding. Put simply, racism is no longer a matter of prejudice description, but rather one of visual education, objectivity, and science. First in biology and criminology, as the Young Allende pointed out in his student dissertation. Then in economics and law, as he would learn during his years in government, and as we all have confirmed thereafter. Nowadays, racism does not work descriptively, but in the basic images of normalized scientific discourses such as economics and law. We need, thus, different exemplars or educational images to inspire a groundless cosmopolitanism, one that carries us up just as we think we're falling. Kant's metropolitan cosmopolitanism, including its later versions, Rawls's law of peoples or Habermas's legal theory, is scientific and metropolitan in the sense that it has a physical rather than metaphysical grounding. But what exactly is this kind of grounding he calls physical, which involves a visual perspective that makes calculable space as well as time? After the downfall of linear horizontal perspective, the standpoint that replaces it is that of a vertical form of calculation seen through the lenses and on the screens of information industries. Nowadays, finance and the media, information and entertainment public sphere. Kant concluded that for knowledge to be possible, we observers must project upon the world a sense of unity. Crucially, this sense is akin to the unitary time flow of a narrative in which events follow one another in linear way from beginning to end. To get this sense of completeness, he says we must project into the future the sense of an ending or a purpose. This means to bring within sight what we cannot see. Only then, when we make for ourselves an image of the world and the future that grounds its calculability, we discover, according to Kant, the hidden necessity of a reality otherwise subject to chance. This is a use of reason made practical by anticipatory scientific techniques, for instance, probabilistic reasoning. But how is it that, according to Kant, we create images that are projected onto the world and into the future as if the space, time, were a screen or a canvas? It seems to me that this is the point where technology becomes an issue for critique. Kant actually distinguishes between technical practical and moral practical reason, suggesting that ethical, political, and legal concerns about freedom, law, revolutionary enthusiasm, and cosmopolitanism arise in the projection from techniques to rights. This is to say that freedom, justice, and rights are not concepts, but rather images through which we subject ourselves and nature to technical programs or projects. Put otherwise, such terms designate anticipatory fantasies that we project upon the world in order to make it stable, or, in Kantian parlance, grounded and whole. Using our imagination, we map out uncharted territories in time and space, just as the navigators of old did, in order to give ourselves a sense of direction or purpose in what would otherwise be an uncertain environment. And we do this, according to Kant, for purely practical reasons. However, as we have seen before, this exercise in projective judgment that brings within sight what we cannot see also, at one and the same time, displaces it out of view. The result is a very specific kind of blindness. only the disappearance of the all-seeing observer and his imaginary stable ground, the vanishing of the heroic knower and the sovereign subject, might open up the normative dimension of fidelity and truthfulness that corresponds to groundless knowledge seen through projective lenses and on screens. To me, that is precisely the significance of Allende's death. The interruption of the Chilean revolution, a revolution through law, and his becoming electromagnetic debris, gathered and intensified for us on the web. The counter-revolution, still ongoing in spite of its proven failure, embraces a rule of law and economics that commands the mapping and surveillance of entire regions of thought, time, and space, ultimately the world and the future. In our time, the proxy perspective projects delusions of stability, security, and extreme mastery onto a backdrop of expanded 3D sovereignty. It recreates societies in imagination as free-falling urban abysses and splintered terrains of occupation, surveilled aerially or virtually on the internet and policed biopolitically. This is the point in which I would like to enter into a dialogue with Eduardo's talk yesterday. According to Eduardo, in the course of his dismantling of the modern dialectic between tradition and knowledge, the epistemic machine, as he calls it, Mendieta emphasizes the role played by the perspective of the knower-observer as authorized ventriloquist of the object world in which it has been traced. This mapping, bounding, and circumscribing of the world and its objects, which I have called before the view from above, is not only a cognitive activity but also an imaginary one. A deculturing device, says Mendieta, in his The Ethics of Not Knowing, that dehistoricizes subjects and objects, rendering both inert, disinterested, pristine, in a word, timeless. He goes on to argue that there is an insurmountable unevenness, a gap, a groundless gap between knowing and unknowing, or disavowed knowledge, that renders all knowledge precarious, revocable, and perishable. What follows from this insight is not skepticism, and is not relativism, but rather an ethics that is also a politics. It is, in a word, situated, historical. Both the end of the priority of epistemology, that is to say, of the commonly assumed results of Kant's Copernican revolution, which seen from the perspective I am assuming, reading Mendieta against himself, looks rather counter-revolutionary. But also of a visual trope that sides light with reason, presents the mind as a lighthouse whose beacon guides us through the hazards of the ocean of opinion, ignorance, and faith onto the continent of knowledge. But notice here the deliberative association between the enterprise of knowledge as perspective, navigation, coloniality, and taking possession of the globe, but also with the internet and drone surveillance or death from above. Mendieta takes up the challenge of fidelity in relation to Jürgen Habermas's more recent turn from communication and Rawlsian justice to religion and redemptive or remedial justice in an emerging dialogue with American philosopher Cornel West's prophetic imagination. To me, this amounts to the more contemporary brand of Frankfurt critical theory taking a decolonial turn. There are two precedents for such a turn in the 20th century, the implications of which remain to be studied. Implications that are normative as well as legal and political. First, Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse's stance on the revolution through legal means that was to be the democratic reconstruction of Germany after World War II, in the context of their little-known preparatory work with the team of American Chief Prosecutor Justice Robert H. Jackson during the Nuremberg trials. I conceive of Allende's own revolution through legal means in the 1970s, Chile, as a decolonized and more generic instantiation of this legacy and succession. The second president, following immediately in the wake of the 11th of September 1973 coup against Allende, is the reappraisal of the first Russell Tribunal by the Latin American members of the second Russell Tribunal, which deliberated between 1974 and 1975. Brazilian government just entered into an agreement with the Leilo Basso Foundation to digitize the archives of the second Russell Tribunal. I have used part of that documentation during my research for Historia del Fortone, and can tell you there are nothing if not short of path-breaking. That is the direction of our common research should follow, throwing ourselves into these objects without reservation. Put simply, and to conclude, I believe current and predominant conceptual configurations of philosophy, law, and art are the result of an optical illusion. I have referred to such configuration as the view from above, and related it to the conceptual perspective that emerged among post-Renaissance and colonial navigators, cartographers, and financiers throughout and after the age of discoveries and empire. But I have learned from filmmakers and visual theorists that the view from above also emerged out of a series of innovations in visual and image technologies. The method of sighting an object, the astrolabe, the sextant, and the quadrant, or if you like a 21st century example, the Black-Scholes algorithm, which was behind the 2008 financial catastrophe. Notice that all the language of modern finance follows, to the letter, the language of navigation. Return, profit is returned after having taken to uncertain seas for investment. All of these technological developments depend upon the invention of linear perspective, and profoundly impacted our sense of a spatial and temporal orientation. Our traditional sense of orientation, and with it our modern concepts of space and time, are based on a stable line, the horizon line. As some visual theories have explained, its stability hinges on the stability of an observer, who is thought to be located on a ground of sorts, a shoreline, a boat, a ground that can be imagined as stable, even if in fact it is not. The horizon line was an extremely important element in navigation. We have also learned, specifically transatlantic navigation. It defined the limits of communication and understanding. What the visual theorists lack, together with contemporary philosophers of communication, is the connection between the idea of limits sprung from the horizon line and the normative and political reordering of the world. I have provided that connection. Now I wish to challenge the narrative and world picture that has resulted from such a connection, whose effects are so insidious and ubiquitous we barely notice them. It is the dominant ideology of our times, one with profound and deadly effects in reality. The story of 11th of September 1973 illustrates such catastrophic effects. But my first concern is not with illustration. Rather, I want to challenge yours mine, dominant sense of narrative and orientation. This led me to present the narrative structure as well as the importance of the characters and imagery of Story of a Death Foretold, following the path suggested by Chilean poet and filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky.